As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the quiet town, Alex Carter's heart raced with anticipation. After 15 grueling months in Afghanistan, he was finally returning home. But little did he know that a seemingly ordinary stop at a gas station would thrust him into a confrontation that would challenge everything he believed about courage and restraint. In a moment that would ripple through his life and the lives of others, Alex would discover that the true battle was not fought on foreign soil, but in the heart of his own hometown. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty highway as Alex Carter guided his pickup truck into the small-town gas station. The familiar sight of American flags fluttering in the gentle breeze brought a lump to his throat. After 15 months in Afghanistan, even the most ordinary scenes of home felt extraordinary. Alex's calloused hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he pulled up to the pump. His combat boots hit the cracked concrete, and for a moment, he had to remind himself that this wasn't a combat zone. No need to scan the rooftops or check for IEDs. Old habits die hard, he thought, allowing himself a small smile. In his uniform, he stood out like a lighthouse in the darkness. The few other customers at the gas station gave him respectful nods, some mouthing silent thank yous. It was different from the wary looks of Afghan civilians or the intense focus of his fellow soldiers. Here, he was just another American coming home. As he filled his tank, Alex pulled out his phone and looked at the last photo he'd received from Sarah, his wife. Their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, was missing her 2 front teeth in the picture, grinning widely at the camera. "Your daughter lost another tooth," Sarah had written. "Hurry home, soldier." That was 3 months ago, and neither of them knew he was coming home today. The surprise would be worth every mile of the long drive. The digital numbers on the pump clicked steadily upward, and Alex's mind wandered to the last video call he'd had with them. Emma had proudly shown him her science project, a solar system made of painted styrofoam balls, and Sarah had tried to hide her tears behind her smile. He'd seen that same look countless times on the faces of military spouses, a mixture of pride, worry, and longing that seemed to age them beyond their years. Inside the store, the air conditioning hit him like a wave of reality. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating aisles of colorful snacks and drinks, a stark contrast to the monotone palette of his recent life in the desert. He grabbed a coffee and stood in line, his mind already racing ahead to the moment he'd pull into his driveway. Would Emma recognize him immediately? He'd kept his hair regulation short, but his face was more weathered now, lined with experiences he'd never fully share with them. Sarah would know, though. She always could read the changes in him, even the ones he tried to hide. The elderly cashier, her gray hair tied back in a neat bun, smiled warmly as she rang up his coffee. "Coming home or heading out, soldier?" she asked, her eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Coming home," Alex replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "Finally. Well, welcome back to American soil," she said, pushing his change across the counter. "We're glad to have you back safe." Alex nodded his thanks, not trusting his voice. It was these small moments of kindness that hit him the hardest. In Afghanistan, everything was intense, immediate, and clear-cut. Here, emotions snuck up on you in the quiet moments, in the simple exchanges that reminded you what you'd been fighting for. Back in his truck, Alex checked his GPS. 2 more hours until he'd reach home. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks out colors that reminded him of Sarah's favorite dress, the one she wore on their last date before his deployment. He'd memorized every detail of that evening, pulling it out like a worn photograph during the longest nights overseas. As he pulled back onto the highway, Alex felt the weight of his dog tags against his chest. They'd been a constant reminder of who he was and what he represented during his deployment. Now, they felt like a bridge between his 2 worlds, the soldier he'd been and the husband and father he needed to become again. The miles stretched ahead of him, each one bringing him closer to home. Alex turned on the radio, letting the familiar country music fill the cab of his truck. He dreamed of this drive for months, the peaceful monotony of American highways, the freedom to stop whenever he wanted, the knowledge that at the end of the road, His family waited. What he didn't know then was that his journey home was about to take an unexpected turn. The next stop would test everything his military training had taught him, not about warfare, but about courage, restraint, and the true meaning of strength. But for now, Alex Carter drove on, his heart growing lighter with each mile marker that passed, counting down the moments until he could hold his family in his arms again. The setting sun painted the sky in deepening shades of purple as Alex's truck ate up the miles. In his pocket, his phone held dozens of photos of Emma and Sarah, but he didn't need to look at them. Their faces were etched in his memory, becoming clearer with every mile that brought him closer to home. Soon, he thought, soon the photos would be replaced by the real thing, and the long wait would finally be over. The fluorescent lights of the small-town gas station buzzed overhead as Alex Carter stepped out of the restroom. His watch showed 7:45 p.m., still plenty of time to make it home before Emma's bedtime. The elderly cashier who had welcomed him earlier was now busy restocking shelves, her movements careful and methodical. The bell above the door chimed, and the atmosphere in the store shifted instantly. 3 large men in leather vests strutted in, their heavy boots echoing against the linoleum floor. The lead biker, a hulking figure with a graying beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, sneered as his eyes landed on Alex's uniform. Alex's combat-trained senses kicked in automatically. 3 subjects, multiple tattoos suggesting possible prison time. The leader's stance indicated former boxing experience. The youngest one, barely in his 20s, had a knife poorly concealed in his right boot. The third, wearing a bandana, kept touching his lower back, possible concealed weapon. Well, the leader's voice dripped with mock sweetness. Look what we got here, boys. One of Uncle Sam's toy soldiers. Alex maintained his position near the coffee station, deliberately keeping his movements slow and controlled as he added cream to his cup. His mind flashed back to his training. De-escalation first. Maintain situational awareness. Control the environment when possible. The youngest biker, eager to impress his companions, stepped closer. Hey, hero, how many kids did you kill over there? He laughed, but his eyes darted nervously between Alex and his leader, seeking approval. The elderly cashier had stopped restocking, her hand gripping a can of beans tightly. Alex caught her eye and gave her a subtle shake of his head. Stay out of this. He'd seen enough conflict to know when someone was looking for a fight versus looking for an audience. Awful quiet for a big bad soldier. The bandana-wearing biker taunted, moving to flank Alex's left side. What's wrong? Taliban cut out your tongue? Alex took a deliberate sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the leader. He'd learned in Afghanistan that the most dangerous moments often came disguised as simple provocations. The key was to recognize the difference between threats that required immediate action and those that were merely attempts to provoke a response. The leader stepped closer, invading Alex's personal space. The smell of leather and stale cigarettes filled the air between them. You know what I think? He growled, his breath hot with the stench of cheap whiskey. I think all you military types are just playing dress-up, acting tough with your fancy uniforms and medals. Alex's hand remained steady as he replaced the coffee cup lid. His mind calculated distances, angles, potential weapons, and escape routes not out of fear, but from years of training. The security camera in the corner would capture everything. The store's layout offered multiple defensive positions. The elderly cashier had moved closer to the phone. Nothing to say, soldier boy? The leader reached out, his fingers moving toward the combat infantry badge on Alex's chest. Maybe we should see if these medals are even real. Alex shifted his weight slightly, preparing for what he knew was coming. He'd spent 15 months in one of the world's most dangerous regions, facing enemies who meant to kill him. These 3 were dangerous in their own way, but they were also predictable, the kind of men who mistook kindness for weakness and confused restraint with fear. The youngest biker, emboldened by Alex's continued silence, moved to circle behind him. Maybe we should teach him some respect for the real Americans who stayed home and... Son? Alex spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority that had commanded men in battle. You really don't want to finish that sentence. The sudden break in his silence caught them off guard. The leader's eyes narrowed, searching Alex's face for any sign of fear or uncertainty. Instead, he found the steady gaze of a man who had faced far worse threats and emerged stronger. The tension in the store had reached a breaking point. The elderly cashier's hand hovered near the phone, and the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder in the silence. Outside, the sun had fully set, casting long shadows through the store windows. Alex knew the next few moments would determine how this situation played out. He'd faced similar crossroads before, moments where the choice between violence and restraint balanced on a knife's edge. The difference was, this time he wasn't in a war zone. This was home, and he had a responsibility to handle this situation in a way that honored both his training and the uniform he wore. The leader's fingers were inches from Alex's badge now, and time seemed to slow down. In Afghanistan, Alex had learned that the moments before an attack were often eerily quiet, like the calm before a storm. This moment felt the same, charged with potential energy waiting to be released. What happened next would change not just this evening, but the lives of everyone involved. The question wasn't whether Alex could handle these three men. His training had prepared him for far worse. The real question was how to handle it in a way that would teach them the lesson they so desperately needed to learn. Time crystallized into a single moment as the leader's fingers made contact with Alex's combat infantry badge. In that split second, Alex's mind flashed back to the day he'd earned it. A firefight in a remote Afghan valley where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. This situation was different, but the principles remained the same. Protect, don't destroy. Neutralize, don't escalate. The leader's grip closed around the badge, and Alex moved. To the elderly cashier watching from behind the counter, it seemed as if the soldier had barely shifted. But in that microscopic movement lay years of combat training and battlefield experience. Alex's left hand clamped down on the leader's wrist, applying precise pressure to nerve points while his right foot pivoted slightly, adjusting his center of gravity. The leader's eyes widened in surprise as he found himself suddenly off balance. His arm locked in a position that sent shooting pain through his shoulder. What the F? The youngest biker lunged forward, reaching for his boot knife. Alex had already anticipated this move. Without releasing the leader, he used the man's own momentum to create a human barrier between himself and the knife-wielding youngster. The leader's bulk crashed into his young companion, sending them both stumbling backward. The third biker, the one with the bandana, reached behind his back. Alex's voice cut through the chaos like a steel blade. The cameras already recorded you reaching for what I assume is an illegal weapon. Think carefully about your next move. The entire sequence had taken less than 5 seconds, but the power dynamic in the store had shifted completely. The leader was now on one knee, his arms still locked in Alex's grip, face contorted in a mixture of pain and disbelief. The young biker had dropped his knife, which skittered across the floor and came to rest near the candy aisle. The third man's hand froze halfway to his back. "Here's what's going to happen," Alex continued, his voice remaining calm and measured. "I'm going to release you. You're going to pick up your friend's knife, place it on the counter, and then all three of you are going to walk out of this store. The security footage will show that I acted in self-defense after you attempted to assault a uniformed service member. How this ends is up to you." The elderly cashier had already dialed 911, her whispered conversation barely audible over the store's background music. Through the windows, Alex could see other customers in the parking lot, some with phones raised, recording the scene. "You broke my damn arm," the leader growled, though the fear in his voice betrayed his bravado. "No, I didn't," Alex replied. "But I could have. Just like I could have broken your jaw, crushed your knee, or done any number of things that my training prepared me for. Instead, you're getting a lesson in humility that you desperately needed." The third biker, reading the situation, slowly raised his hands. "Look, man, we don't want any trouble. Tommy here just had too much to drink," started running his mouth. "The time to avoid trouble was before you decided to harass a stranger," Alex said. "But it's not too late to make the right choice now." With precise control, Alex released the leader's arm. The man stumbled to his feet, rubbing his shoulder, his earlier bravado replaced by a mix of shame and anger. The young biker remained frozen. His earlier confidence evaporated in the face of real combat expertise. "The knife?" Alex reminded them, nodding toward the dropped weapon. The leader hesitated for a moment, then jerked his head at the youngest biker. "Do it, Jake." The young man scrambled to retrieve the knife, placing it carefully on the counter as instructed. His hands were shaking. "Now, I suggest you leave before the police arrive," Alex said. "They'll have questions about that concealed weapon you're carrying," he added, looking at the man with the bandana, who paled visibly. The three men backed toward the door, their earlier swagger replaced by nervous glances and uncertain movements. As they reached the entrance, the leader turned back, his face working through various emotions before settling on something close to respect. "We didn't know. We thought." He stammered. "That's the problem." Alex cut him off. "You didn't think. Real strength isn't about intimidation or violence. It's about protection and restraint. Remember that the next time you feel like teaching someone respect." The bell chimed again as they hurried out, their motorcycles roaring to life moments later. Through the windows, Alex watched them speed away into the night, their tail lights disappearing around the corner just as police sirens began to wail in the distance. The elderly cashier emerged from behind the counter, her hands still trembling slightly, but her eyes filled with admiration. "In all my years," she began, then stopped, shaking her head in amazement. "That was something else, young man." Alex's combat-heightened senses began to settle, his heartbeat returning to its normal rhythm. He noticed his coffee cup had somehow remained upright through the entire confrontation, steam still rising from its lid. "Ma'am," he said, managing a small smile, "would you mind showing the officers the security footage when they arrive? I need to make a phone call." He reached for his phone, thinking of Sarah and Emma waiting at home, unaware of how their evening had almost taken a very different turn. The incident had lasted less than 2 minutes, but its impact would ripple out far beyond this small-town gas station. Sometimes, Alex reflected, the most important battles weren't fought on foreign soil, but in everyday moments where one person's choices could change multiple lives forever. The red and blue lights of police cruisers painted the gas station parking lot in alternating colors as Officer Sarah Chun reviewed the security footage for the third time. Her expression shifted from professional detachment to barely concealed admiration as she watched the scene unfold on the small monitor. "Mr. Carter," she said, turning to Alex who stood nearby. "This is textbook self-defense. Actually," she amended with a slight smile, "it's better than textbook. I've never seen anyone handle a 3-on-1 situation with such restraint." The elderly cashier, who had introduced herself as Mrs. Margaret Wilson, nodded vigorously. He protected himself and everyone in the store without really hurting anyone. Those men came in looking for trouble, but they found something else entirely. Outside, 2 other officers were taking statements from customers who had witnessed the incident through the store windows. Several had recorded videos on their phones, which were already beginning to circulate on social media. One clip, showing Alex's precise and controlled response to the attempted assault, had already garnered thousands of views. "We've identified the suspects," Officer Chun continued, consulting her notebook. "Tommy Reeves, Jake Peterson, and Michael Dawson. All 3 have prior records, mainly assault and disturbing the peace. The concealed weapon violation will be particularly interesting to their parole officers." Alex nodded, his mind already drifting to home. "Will you need anything else from me, officer?" "Actually," Chen replied, "there is one thing. The chief would like to." She was interrupted by the arrival of a local news van, its satellite dish extending skyward as a reporter and cameraman spilled out onto the parking lot. The story was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. "Great," Alex muttered. This wasn't the kind of attention he'd wanted, especially not on his first day back. Mrs. Wilson touched his arm gently. "You know, son, sometimes the stories we try to avoid are the ones that need to be told the most." Her eyes, wise behind her wire-rimmed glasses, held his gaze. What happened here tonight? Well, it might teach more people than just those three troublemakers. The reporter, a young woman in a pressed blazer, was already setting up for a live broadcast. The gas station sign glowed behind her, creating a perfect backdrop for the evening news. Alex could hear fragments of her practice run. Decorated soldier, defused situation, minimal force. Officer Chen's radio crackled to life. Units responding to Riverside Station, be advised. Suspects in the assault incident have turned themselves in at the precinct. Repeat, suspects are in custody. Alex raised an eyebrow and Chen smiled. Looks like your lesson made quite an impression, she said. They're probably hoping to get ahead of the social media storm. The videos are already trending. Inside the store, customers had begun to return, many seemingly more interested in meeting the soldier from the videos than buying anything. Mrs. Wilson was holding court behind her counter, proudly recounting the events to anyone who would listen. He moved like nothing I've ever seen, she told a wide-eyed teenager. But it wasn't just what he did. It was what he didn't do. He could have really hurt those men, but he chose not to. That's real strength right there. The police chief arrived shortly after, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and a commanding presence. He reviewed the footage, spoke briefly with Alex, and then faced the growing media presence with a prepared statement. What we witnessed here tonight was not just skilled self-defense, but a demonstration of the highest principles of military training and personal conduct. Mr. Carter showed us that true courage isn't about winning fights. It's about preventing them when possible and minimizing harm when they can't be avoided. As the chief spoke, Alex received a text message. It was from Sarah. Where are you? Emma's getting worried. Attached was a photo of their daughter, clutching her favorite stuffed animal and trying to stay awake on the couch. Officer Chun, Alex said, showing her the message. I really need to get home. Chun nodded, understanding. Of course, we have your statement and all the evidence we need. The chief will probably want to speak with you again tomorrow. But for now, she gestured toward his truck. Go home, soldier. As Alex prepared to leave, Mrs. Wilson hurried from behind her counter. Wait, she pressed a small package into his hands, a candy bar, the same kind he'd seen Emma enjoying in recent photos. For your little girl, she said with a warm smile. And thank you for showing us what a real hero looks like. The media tried to catch him for interviews as he walked to his truck, but Alex politely declined. This story wasn't about him, not really. It was about choices, consequences, and the kind of strength that comes from knowing when not to use force. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the news crews were still filming, the police lights still flashing, and social media was still buzzing with videos of the incident. But Alex's mind was already miles ahead, focused on the real story waiting for him at home. A story of homecoming, family, and the quiet courage it takes to be a father and husband after being a warrior. The familiar streets of Alex's neighborhood were quiet as his truck turned onto Cedar Lane. Christmas lights still hung on some houses, twinkling like earthbound stars in the early evening darkness. His GPS had long since fallen silent. These last few turns were etched in his memory from countless dreams during his deployment. 9:47 p.m. Later than he'd planned, but the lights in his house still burned bright. Through the living room window, he could see the flicker of the TV, and his heart skipped a beat when a small shadow, Emma's, passed across the curtains. As he pulled into the driveway, Alex caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. His uniform was still crisp, showing no signs of the gas station confrontation. The combat infantry badge that had sparked the entire incident gleamed softly in the dashboard lights. 15 months of war, and it was a small-town gas station that had given him his final test of courage. His phone had been buzzing continuously for the last hour, messages from fellow soldiers who'd seen the viral videos, news outlets seeking interviews, and even a call from his old commanding officer. But none of that mattered now. He silenced the device and stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The front door opened before he reached it. Daddy! Emma's voice pierced the quiet night, full of joy and disbelief. She launched herself from the doorway, her sock-clad feet barely touching the porch steps. Alex caught her in mid-flight, lifting her high into the air before pulling her close to his chest. She smelled of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. Sarah appeared in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. For a moment, she stood frozen, as if afraid he might disappear if she moved. Then she was running too, wrapping her arms around both of them, her tears soaking into his uniform. "You're early," she managed between sobs. "You weren't supposed to be home for another week." "Surprise?" Alex whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. Emma's arms were locked around his neck, and she was chattering rapidly about everything he'd missed: her science fair project, her loose tooth, the cat that had adopted their backyard. They stood there on the front lawn, a family reunited, while the world spun on around them. Somewhere across town, 3 bikers were spending the night in jail, contemplating the lessons they'd learned about respect and true strength. At the gas station, Mrs. Wilson was probably still telling the story to her customers. Online, the videos of the confrontation continued to spread, carrying their own message about courage and restraint. But here, in this moment, Alex was just a father holding his daughter, a husband embracing his wife. The soldier in him could rest now, knowing that the skills that had kept him alive in war had helped him protect peace at home. "Dad?" Emma said suddenly, pulling back to look at his face. "Why are you on TV?" Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. "It's all over the news. The gas station? Those men?" She touched his face gently. "Are you okay?" Alex smiled, shifting Emma to his hip as they walked inside. "I'm better than okay. I'm home." Their house was exactly as he remembered it, though Emma's artwork now covered more of the refrigerator, and new family photos had joined the collection on the walls. The smell of Sarah's chocolate chip cookies lingered in the air. She must have been stress baking again, something she always did when she was worried. As they settled onto the couch, Emma curled up against his side, refusing to let go. Sarah brought him a plate of still warm cookies and curled up on his other side. On the TV, the local news was still running the story, showing clips from the security footage. The incident has sparked a broader conversation about veterans, courage, and the true meaning of strength, the reporter was saying. Sources say the 3 men involved have expressed remorse and have offered to make formal apologies. Sarah reached for the remote and turned off the TV. "That's enough of that. We have you here now. That's all that matters." Later that night, after Emma had finally fallen asleep in their bed, clutching Alex's hand, Sarah asked him softly, "Were you scared? At the gas station?" Alex thought about it, stroking Emma's hair gently. "Not scared," he said finally. "In Afghanistan, I learned that the most dangerous moments aren't always the ones with gunfire and explosions. Sometimes they're the quiet moments where you have to choose between what's easy and what's right." The next few days would bring more attention: interviews, commendations, and a formal ceremony where the police chief would present him with a Civilian Service Award. The 3 bikers would indeed apologize, and 2 of them would eventually enroll in veterans outreach programs. Their lives changed by their encounter with a soldier who chose mercy over vengeance. But for now, in the quiet of his own home, Alex Carter was simply a warrior who had completed his final mission. He had protected without harming, taught without destroying, and found his way back to the peace he'd fought so hard to defend. Emma stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about showing Daddy her new karate moves tomorrow. Sarah squeezed his hand, and Alex felt the last tension of combat ease from his shoulders. The war was over. He was home. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched over him in Afghanistan. But these stars were different now. They were home stars, peace stars, shining down on a warrior who had learned that the greatest victories are often won without throwing a single punch. And in homes across the country, as Alex's story spread, others would learn this lesson too. Sometimes the most powerful weapon a warrior can wield is the choice not to strike at all.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.